I want to say a big thank you to Matt Englar-Carlson for joining us. And so, Matt, I know you, but for the watchers, do you mind just sharing a quick who you are and how you came to be here?
Sure, sure. My name is Matt Englar-Carlson. I'm a chair and professor in counseling at Cal State Fullerton. And I've been at Cal State Fullerton for almost 25 years, training therapists and training counselors. But prior to that, I worked in schools. I worked in kind of health psych as well settings. But I've always had an interest in understanding kind of boys and understanding kind of gender. And, early part of my career really focused on kind of psychotherapy outcomes and how we can, essentially do whether it's called male sensitive therapy or male affective therapy, but understanding that there are ways in which we may work with male identifying clients differently. And I worked on that I still work in that field within a PA, a CA, ACEs, WACEs, whoever will have me. I work a lot in schools as well, primarily around boys and how to create essentially healthy boyhood structures within school settings. And I think the umbrella around that is just having a focus on whether you call it positive masculinity or healthy masculinity or pro-social masculinity. It goes through a lot of variations, but
Mhm.
I think strength-based work has always been kind of where it's been at for me.
Yeah.
Um, and so I've kind of dabbled in kind of all of this, whether it's with boys and men and fathers, and
Yeah.
I think men's mental health, but I would say men's health actually is what I kind of consider
Yes.
myself now, in terms of global orientation around that.
Right. Okay. Gosh, you took me off on a little rabbit trail there because you mentioned, is it positive masculinity? I'm just going to dive right in. Okay.
Yeah.
Is it positive masculinity? Is it pro-social masculinity? Is it healthy masculinity? Um, what has you kind of rethinking the label or the term? And sorry, this is a
Yeah, yeah.
compound question here. What has you rethinking the label? Does that also mean like you're rethinking the definition? Because I mean, for my viewers, I don't know if they're familiar, but your name is very much tied with developing positive masculinity in the research literature, putting it
Yeah.
out there. It's impacted me. It's what drove me to do my dissertation and create the scale to measure positive masculinity. Yeah. Sorry, I was about to ask you like three more questions in that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I can tell you like a story around some of that, which is, I think that, y- you know, I kind of safe to say, I grew up in our helping profession. So
Yeah.
my dad was a psychologist and a counselor educator.
Oh,
He was
really?
my school, yeah, he was my school counselor.
Oh, really?
So,
Okay.
my dad was John Carlson. He was
Oh,
kind
that's
of
right.
well known in the field, really, I grew up Adlerian, whether I liked it or not. Like, and what reminded me of that is that
You didn't have a choice.
I didn't have a choice. When I took my courses in theories and I started reading Adler and Mora, I was like, this all
Hmm.
makes a little too much sense to me. But I grew up in this environment around um, Adlerians, frankly, and I think that I grew. And again, I'm not saying that um, everything was perfect because it hardly was perfect, but I certainly understood like what was developmental guidance and what was that about, and so like in a strange way, my sister and I were actually the test cases in the '70s for early Adlerian kits that went into the schools.
Hmm.
So we were the ones who played with the puppets and the songs, and that's what was very normal in my life, right? And I think the reason why I'm saying this is like I think my dad had a very positive orientation in terms of how he looked at actually mental health and people, and I think that's very Adlerian in the sense of kind of like that utility piece, like let's look at what we can do with what we have, right? And and I think for me, having that orientation, entering the field, working in kind of health, I have a master's in health psych. I got a master's in actually elementary school counseling. I became a school counselor. worked in a K-8 school, worked with a lot of boys as, you know, boys came to me, as I like to say, attached to the assistant principal,
Hmm.
right? Girls came to me because they wanted to come and talk, right? And I did a lot of
Yeah.
actually early intervention with girls and their moms.
Hmm.
So my early orientation, both as an undergrad, as took to women's studies classes, understood feminism a lot more than I think masculinity. And even when I was doing kind of groups with mothers and their daughters, even the question around how about fathers and sons, and my
Yeah.
response initially was, I don't think they'll come, which was true in the sense of like my experience was not seeing a lot of dads. But the other part of it was I don't think I knew much about it, frankly. Like I don't think I was equipped to to understand what that would look like. And when I came into grad school, I didn't have a clear idea of what I wanted to do research on. I was actually in my end of my second year, and my advisor said, "You pretty much better pick a topic, or I'm going to pick it for you." And she said, "And you're not going to like it." And I realized, like, I was seeing a fair amount of clients. I was at Penn State University. I was seeing clients at the counseling center. I had a lot of male clients,
Yeah.
and I realized that I enjoyed working with them. My clients were continuing on, graduating into a men's group, and I just began to notice some themes. A, that most of these guys were in acute distress when I would see them, and B, I didn't find this work that difficult. What I mean by that is that it
Hmm.
felt very natural for me to work with this population in a way that I think I can make it proactive for them even at times when they were very discouraged. And
Yeah.
I had a professor who then at that time introduced me to some, the psychology of men and gender role conflict and that whole concept. And I got hungry fast, meaning that I didn't know that this was a thing or a field, and I just became voracious.
Yeah.
Like, I read everything, and I read everything in psych and counseling, mental health, sociology, women's studies. I read Foucault, I read anthropology, I read all of this stuff because I just was so hungry about it, and I've always been interdisciplinary, and so I just didn't wanna know this very narrow band. At the same time, I mean, I know this is a long, long story, but I had a lot of exposure to actually narrative therapy and solution-focused work. I was
Mhm.
pretty fascinated by narrative, actually, and actually, Michael White, I saw him give a live demonstration in the early '90s, and that's why I do what I do, actually. I just thought
Wow.
if that's therapy, I wanna do that. And I think I was so again, those approaches very much in a strength-based way of thinking about where we're going.
Yeah.
I'm blending this with this early knowledge around psychology of men and masculinities, and began my career doing this, and then but also having some reservation. And I think the reservation was around, like, I feel like I was learning a lot about what the research says, but recognizing that I knew a lot where men went wrong.
Uh-huh.
I didn't know what right was, and I
Uh-huh.
didn't understand what healthy was. And I also was running these moments with my clients in which what I had been taught and what I had learned wasn't matching,
Yes.
and I began to think to myself, all this stuff I'm learning, does this about about masculinity at the time, why, right? Now masculinity is IES.
Right.
Does this describe me? Does this
Mm.
describe my friends? And does it
Mhm.
describe the men I know in my life, both my my peers, or and men above me, right? Who are older. And I came off in the conclusion, no.
Yeah.
And kind of had these doubts. At the time, had a supervisor at USC named Mark Stevens, and had some of these conversations with him. And again, just a really positive pro force in my life of someone who had just so much life
Mhm.
and was also having these really wonderful relationships and therapy with guys. And then began to realize some other people. I began to talk to Mark Kaselica, who was a professor as well at another university, and realizing that this is like this healthy or positive masculinity was this counter to what I would call negative dark side masculinity, right?
Yeah.
And when that emerged in kind of like, 2000, I think the first time I wrote about it was like 2003, and wrote about a couple different book chapters around boys and working with men and floating this term positive masculinity. And then Mark and I actually wrote a couple papers around this, around putting some traits around it and some conceptual ideas from a very social constructivist perspective.
Mhm.
And, it kind of not sat there, but it existed. And one of the things that's really unique about gender, of course, is that it changes, right? And so how we talk about masculinity, for example, today, is very different from how we were talking about it 20 years ago.
Mhm.
And it's fluid, and I think it is more, again, that's changed from masculinity to masculinities, understanding intersectionality. You know, I think positive masculinity is a great term. I think positive masculinities is better. I
Yeah.
understand that positive has a valence with it, meaning
Yes.
it goes in a certain direction and says this is healthy and that's not. The research has backed it up and not backed it up, if that makes sense. And at the
Yep.
same time, I was always kind of thinking like, what this is really about is healthy masculinity.
Yeah.
And so I think my changing of terms has been more just kind of seeing how the field has kind of shifted, how we talk about masculinity. And in some ways, it may be in contrast to toxic masculinity, let's say. So like, so actually toxic masculinity is a term from the late 70s
Oh,
that exists out there, right? But it
that's not a
becomes
new invention?
no, no, it's no. Well, I was gonna say it's been around much longer than the '70s, but as a term, right? But it began to be used, a little bit under 10 years ago, as this interpersonal, a large element around masculinity of kind of interpersonal conflict, whether it's bullying or
Mhm.
assault or,
Mm.
very aggressive kind of traits around that. And that actually, like, we've been aware of this for a while, right? But
Yeah.
toxic masculinity began to be this umbrella for everything.
Yeah.
And I know from research that using that term does not really land with a lot of guys. At the same time, honestly, I began to use a term called you have toxic masculinity, which is this big kind of stuff. Then you have toxin masculinity,
Okay.
TOXIN, which is probably going to kill you though.
Huh.
So it's like toxic masculinity is all the traits associated with restrictive forms of masculinity,
Yep.
which play into health behaviors, which is why men die anywhere from 4 to 8 years earlier than women in this country, right? And have, past 30 years, right? Which is why, that in the US, death by suicide, 80% of those deaths are male, right?
Yes.
And so looking at these larger issues of mortality, these are not largely biological. They're largely sociological and actually social cultural. And these toxin things is actually what I always kind of thought what we really should be thinking about when it comes to health.
Yeah.
And I think around that, like again, these terms, what we want to call it is important how we use language.
Yes.
Language is socially constructed and it does have meaning. And I learned really quickly that talking with guys about toxic masculinity or talking about what went wrong in their life was not as effective and on asking them about where they
Yeah.
would like. And I think that I've been influenced by a lot of other scholars and thinkers to kind of shift my ideas that to me it was never I think positive masculinity was never a fixed concept. Yeah.
What do you think is the relationship of positive or no, not positive masculinity? We got a lot of terms here. Toxic masculinity to traditional masculinity. Are
Yeah.
those one and the same, or are those distinct?
I think they're distinct
Got
but I don't think again, this is where academics,
it.
you know, this is where their ship typically runs aground because we're not very good at actually having these larger conversations. And so
Yeah.
so we there's ways in which you end up equating toxic masculinity with masculinity or like traditional masculinity.
Yeah.
And I've been always really clear in my writing that, being a if you're a guy who has traditional values and masculinity, it doesn't mean you're unhealthy, right?
Yeah.
And it's always been really but the nuance is the hard part because
Yeah.
it's about rigidity actually.
Yes.
So and again, we can say largely in across the field of psychology, most things that are rigid are not healthy.
Yeah.
But I think this notion of kind of rigid masculinity, and I think we're getting better at this in the field,
Yeah.
but things that come in journals do not translate really well to Fox News, right? Or
Right.
the Wall Street Journal or to just talk radio or the places where you're gonna meet guys.
or the clinical world too, because
No.
there's that research practice gap, and so, sorry, I'm going down a tangent
No,
there,
no, you're right. It's
but
exactly
I
it. Yeah.
but I it's scary how much I agree with you because so much of your views kind of represent how I think, and so I guess I'm gonna get in the weeds here. I hope I don't
Yeah.
lose any listeners, but, when I was doing my dissertation, I was getting into the work of Ryan McDermott,
Yeah.
and so in his 2019 paper, I think it's titled "In Search of a Operational Definition for Positive Masculinity,"
Yeah.
and the items he gathered or generated from that, those are the items I took for my scale. But he was proposing that, positive masculinity isn't really too distinct, from traditional masculinity. He was seeing it as, like, nested or embedded within,
Yeah.
and so as I've pondered that because then I found in my research doing the construct validity, I found that positive masculinity was distinct from traditional masculinity. We don't really have a construct for toxic masculinity. There's
Right.
no construct, there's no operational definition, there's no measure of it. So, I think what I would use as a proxy or a fill-in would probably be that rigid, inflexible adherence to traditional masculinity. In my mind, that's how I make sense of toxic masculinity when we talk about it.
Yeah.
Um, so that's hard to do measurement-wise, statistically to kind of see if, there's really, like, moderate adherence to traditional masculinity, and then there's strict adherence to traditional masculinity. Sorry, I have a head cold.
Okay.
And so then looking at the correlation between positive masculinity and that strict conformity, that's hard to do. At least I'm not sophisticated at that level yet statistically to do that. But I think that would be the analysis I would want to do is to see if those two things really are conceptually distinct. Because I guess the way I was thinking about it, I'll just throw this all at you, and you can tell me if it makes sense. Maybe traditional masculinity is kind of like the umbrella construct. It's the ocean
Yeah.
from which we get like these streams where all the maybe the masculinities come, and maybe there's a broad stream with a lot of little streams. That's the healthy masculinity, and then there's like the dark masculinity with a lot of broad stream, little offshoots of that. I don't know if that's conceptually makes sense or coherent.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a way of thinking about it is like, again, there's lots of ways where you're thinking about whether it's measurement or like structures, how you talk about it, think about it. And I think it's a slippery concept, right? And that
Yeah.
and I would say like many years ago, I think it was probably like maybe 2011 or 12. I was consulting on a project with the CDC who was wanting to do a positive masculinity kind of intervention in high schools. And we spent a long amount of time figuring out what is positive masculinity.
Yeah.
Like, what are you going to call it? Right. And we typically got into pro social, like
Yep.
it's pro social masculinity, which means relationship building, right?
Yes.
It's relationally oriented and it has to be adaptive, right? But like you start throwing around these kind of terms and it's like, in a sense, like, you know, it sounds strange. Everyone knows what toxic masculinity is,
Yeah.
but no one knows what positive masculinity is.
Yeah.
But why? Well, we are so used to seeing toxic or negative, right? And I would say, frankly, because most men in particular, but women too, all people, why are we framed to understand negative and toxic? Because we're trying to avoid it.
Yeah.
We're trying to protect ourselves to stay away from it, right?
Yeah.
And so again, there's safety in this element around like that. And it's harder to understand like that pro-social piece because for men in general, like the pro-social piece has a way of actually being um against the grain,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Right. And if you think about it in many ways, it's, and I would say this for me too, it's like even after like honestly decades of this research and just being like, I mean, my feed each day on masculinity stuff is gross in
Yeah.
the sense of how much I get gross in terms of volume, not gross in terms of yucky.
Well, it's also
Gross.
yucky and gross.
Exactly. Right. So, and even I think after all these decades, I think I have been underestimating the strength of masculine norms.
Yes.
Like, and I'm particularly working with in high school settings. It's like there's not just power in conforming to masculine norms. There's
Yeah.
safety in conforming to masculine norms, right?
Yes.
So the conformity comes in out of pure safety for so many people. right? Because
Mhm.
the way I talk about it is like you do get strokes, and
Mhm.
part of the strokes is you're out of the line of fire, right? But the downside of it is that if you're really good at masculinity,
Mhm.
like you're really good at doing the things you're supposed to do,
Yeah.
what does it get you?
Yeah.
Well, frankly, it probably gets you to middle age, and you probably have some longstanding health issues that you haven't addressed.
Yeah.
Probably have a string of relationships, whether divorces or separations that aren't going well. You're probably disconnected from children if you have them,
Yeah.
and probably don't have a lot of friends. And you're
It's
probably
kind of an
wondering,
empty victory.
yeah, you're wondering to yourself, like, wait a minute, I did all the things I was supposed to do, and this is what I get. This is what was supposed to happen.
Right.
But if you think about it, like, if you do all the things you're supposed to do, who wants to hang out with that person?
Yeah.
Right? Like, that is not a pro-social, that is not a healthy person with everything we know about relationships, right? And so I think filtering all this through some of this, like, I think that goes back to, like, again, me, I tend to be a pretty practical person. I think a lot about what's gonna help people.
Yes.
I certainly understand the critiques of positive masculinity. I this notion around naming certain kind of things but I think in a practical sense, it's like, it would be great if we were all human,
Yeah.
but right, I agree with that, but the fact of the matter is that's not how we see each other
Yeah. Yeah.
yet,
But
right?
I just to take a kind of a because you kinda went a clinical direction there, so
Yeah,
just to
yeah.
kind of follow you in a clinical direction and maybe kinda loop it back to Adlerian, I guess I feel very inspired by Adler. And then when I talk to my male clients, because now I put that online, my niche is specializing in men's mental health, and shockingly, Matt, I get a lot of men. That's like that's unheard of. Like what I advertise for, I actually attract. Like that's a
Yeah,
first in my career. So I don't know why that's happening, but I'm excited about probably 70% of my caseload is men who
yeah,
are specifically coming to me because they said, "Well, you talk about mental health issues, and I wanna talk about that, and
yeah,
I'm feeling stuck." So that's really exciting. I feel very fulfilled in my career right now clinically, but I guess my thought would be is like Adler with the inferiority complex idea and, like, your mission, your job is to kind of work through your own sense of inferiority and, like, allow yourself to kind of experience a full humanity, and that's one thought I've kind of proposed to men is those rigid, strict, inflexible ideas that we have about masculinity, they're kind of leading you into these behaviors that are harmful to you and to others.
yeah,
And that right there poses I've seen it occur. Like I just see the cognitive dissonance in real time where like, oh, I don't want that because I don't want to harm
right,
my kids, my loved ones, my significant other, my family members, my coworkers, my community members. I don't want that. I want to be protective of them and care for them and contribute to all those relationships. And so I just see like I just allow the cognitive dissonance to kind of do its work because
yeah,
well, I'm adhering to these cultural notions that are leading me down these pathways of hurting those I love and hurting myself. If I don't want to hurt them, I shouldn't hurt myself. I got to care for myself to care for them. So then like the logic just kind of unravels and then a new logic kind of plays out where I can and I guess that's where the positive masculinity comes in. Is it opens up a pathway of still affirming my manhood, but now I get to engage in strength-based, pro-social,
yeah,
healthy behaviors that helps the individual male client and all his relationships. And so that's how I see it clinically playing out. And I've had hundreds of those conversations, and I guess kind of back to your comment earlier of when you feel like you're in the zone and like the sweet spot, and like those are the conversations that fill you up the most. Like to me, I could do that every day, all day, for free,
yeah,
just ad nauseum. So, but I guess that's how it plays out for me. The concepts that you developed with Mark Kisleka, that's how that plays out for me clinically in a practical sense.
yeah,
And so I don't know. I guess there's the clinician brain that I have, and then there's the researcher brain that I have, and they're not always in agreement or sit comfortably with each other.
right, right.
And so I totally lost my question. Sorry, Matt. But yeah, I guess that's where I go clinically, and I hear you kind of suggesting that this has to be clinically relevant. Whatever we're developing academically, it has to have some clinical cachet to it.
Yeah, and I frankly, I think we're really bad at that.
Yeah.
And I think honestly, um, I've come to that conclusion, meaning that I think that I've spent the good part of 2 decades kind of writing about counseling and psychotherapy with male clients and put all the things out there, looking at the research and synthesizing the research and giving lots of presentations to anyone who will have me, right? Like any allied helping professionals, I'll come talk to you, right? And the reality is like, yeah, we've seen some changes in the numbers in terms of who's seeking help, but not a lot, and I think we're kind of still back where we were 25 years ago, which is like guys don't want to come to see the therapist, or they don't want to seek help. Let's make it broad,
Yeah.
in a way like I'm here, I'm open. So like, what's wrong with you guys? What's wrong with you guys? And I
Yeah.
think for me, it's like the reality is like we clearly have a population that's in need. We
Yes.
clearly have a population who have needs, who is clearly saying repeatedly, essentially, I don't want this crappy service you're offering,
Yeah.
and we're like the lunch person who keeps offering the same sandwich
Yeah.
that no one wants. And they were like, "Well, why don't you want the sandwich?" You
Yeah.
know? Like, I'm giving you food, and I think there's ways around it that it's
Yeah.
really kind of shifted my way of thinking about it, which is, when are we gonna start listening to
Yes.
guys? When we start, and I mean that like, and I've had some experiences in the past 4 or 5 years that have really shaped me around that. Like, I was involved with an app called Mental, which is the first mental health app for men. It exists. It's on, you can download it, Google Play, whatnot. But, you know, it was tailored towards men. It was very pro-social oriented. It was very, I would say, very positive, strength-based masculinity. No pot shots at anyone, like no low blows, but it used a lot of humor. It was aimed at
Yeah.
guys, aimed at men. Anyone could use it, and they did, right? But in the process of that, like, I read a lot of data from, and these are guys probably who weren't gonna seek help anyway, haven't sought help
Yeah.
before. And I read data that was just heartbreaking
Yeah.
of, guys on the app at 2 AM and 3 AM, just in suffering with pain
Yeah.
around relationship issues or feeling less than or being unemployed or just out of hope,
Yeah.
and I think it just sensitized me again and again and again, which is like, we are not meeting this population where they are,
Yeah, and it's
you
a
know?
big population, and
Yeah.
it's a very lethal population for themselves and for others,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I guess my thought too is I was gonna go down one direction, I'm gonna go another direction. I think even though like, I squarely put the responsibility on us, the helpers. Like, I think we have been so sluggish and non-responsive to meeting the needs of men and truly understanding their barriers to accessing the sloppy Joe, the boring sloppy Joe that we're offering that
Yeah.
they don't
Yeah.
wanna eat.
Yeah.
I think we have to reconceptualize the sloppy Joe and like, okay,
Yeah.
they're wanting something else, let's give them that. But then also just bridging the gap too. Like I'm doing a study right now. It's a enhanced critical incident response study. And so we're asking about significant moments in their life where they chose not to seek counseling, where they thought maybe I need counseling, but I can't go, I won't go, and their decision making around that. And, I mean, a lot of these men are expressing it didn't the service didn't seem like it'd be helpful. They didn't see the benefit in doing it.
Yeah.
And so it's like, at some point, I think we're gonna have to bridge the gap and make a connection, some inroads with that community. But now I see like, okay, who else is talking about it? No one. Crickets. It's you, Mark Kiselica, and who else? A handful of other people who are academics and
Yeah.
publishing papers. No one really kind of on the clinical side. And
Yeah.
that's kind of where the action's happening. And even the clinical side, we're kind of in our comfortable offices, but then, men are out there in the real world not coming.
I think you have to get out of the journals, frankly, and out of your office, and you gotta go start talking to guys. And you
Yeah.
gotta start talking to the populations, because I think that, at my core, what I do believe is that guys want help. And I think most therapists, clinicians, counselors who work with men successfully will say how much they enjoy working with men.
Yeah.
Because when you hit the sweet spot, it's almost like they never wanna leave, you know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? And I even saw that, like, in a variety of ways through an app, right? Like, when
Yeah.
when guys have their lived experience validated back in a way, it is like gushing because it's never happened before. And I think when that happens, but again, you also have to harness some other kind of things, which is, like you have to go where people are, right? Like,
Yeah.
and COVID has taught us that. Like COVID, one of the best things about COVID is we didn't make people come to us, right?
Yeah.
And that was a
Are
big
you talking
thing,
about telehealth?
whether it's telehealth, but
Yeah.
even prior to that, like we do have some really good models
Yeah.
of actually embedding kind of clinical services at the workplace, whether it's with the fire
Yes.
department. People, we've seen it in the military. We've actually seen it in professional sports. I mean, the
Yes.
Milwaukee Bucks were the first team to hire a full-time therapist, psychologist, who went to every practice, was a part of the team, flew on the plane, and was there for everyone there, not just the players.
Right.
And I'm not saying that's why they won the championship after decade. I think someone else had a bit to do with that, but I think has a bit to do with it in the sense like,
Yeah.
and now that model is a part of professional sports, right? It's this embedding model, but but I think some organizations like Movember can show you what happens when you kind of create services that are aligned with the population's need, right? And what it
Mhm.
does, it gets at, they fund a lot of that research. So again, I do
Mm.
Movember and that with the Movember Institute, which has a massive investment in men's mental health, but it's also talking frankly about things like suicide and suicidal ideation.
Yep.
And I think again, even as a profession, I don't think we really understand it.
No.
Like how many times have I been in classes where I kind of use that number, that 80%, and people are shocked,
Yes.
right? But I think I've just come to the point where I just have to be very blunt and frank about it, which is I'm going to talk about that straight up. One of the first things,
Yeah.
because, most people know someone who's died by suicide.
Yeah.
And then when I say, and my bet is that they were male, you can see it in their eyes. Like, yeah, they almost all were. About 80% of them were actually, you know? And if you're like me, who's in his mid 50s, sadly, I can give you, I can count on more than one hand how many men I know who died by suicide.
Mhm.
And I can speak about other my brother who's, his early 40s,
Mhm.
very different from me. By the time he was 25, he probably had 5 friends who died by suicide,
Mhm.
right? And I think it's like, that is trauma, and that is a
Yes.
way that we get socialized into just accepting it, and I mean, this is my perspective, I can't back it up with research, but I truly believe that actually, like, suicide ideation is somewhat normative for men. I think it's, and I'm not saying that means they're going to go a step further, but it's normative
Mhm.
to consider suicide as a way to end suffering,
Mhm.
and I think, again, most guys are so afraid to bring that up because they're afraid that when they do, they lose control.
Yes. Or afraid of being a burden. I think
Yep,
I've seen that
right,
too.
exactly,
Or
exactly.
afraid of being seen as weak. And I usually bring up the 80% too, and then I also bring up the research from Fowler and colleagues in 2022, I think it was, where they found I think they did a forensic analysis of over, like, 70,000 cases, and they found that over 60%, there was no known mental health history, no known diagnoses, no known mental health treatment engagements in their medical record, and so I think that fits with what you're saying, Matt, and it makes me also think of Ron Levant's concept of the normative male alexithymia.
Yeah,
I think there's also a normative male self-neglect and a normative male suicidality potentially as well, because
yeah.
it's like I've got all these emotions and these needs, but I'm restricted from expressing them and getting support and help. Where do I go? There's nowhere to go. Okay, I'll take my life.
If you talk to guys about that in that space, like they actually will talk about it pretty bluntly, and they'll talk about it in a way almost with a nobility.
Yeah.
I'm doing this out of sacrifice, right? But it's a way in which they're also not seeing this
Yes.
right? And I think that there's a way in which, again, this whole notion of what we call suicide script theory
Mm.
talks about this, right? About how in some ways kind of males are socialized in Western society to view their lives as disposable. And so it's not, again, it's not a stretch. Like, do I think these guys actually want to kill themselves? No, I think they want to stop suffering. They're
Yeah.
not sure how to do it, and I don't think we have the sensitivity in the field to understand that. And
Right.
so, and there is research, there's so much research about this that it isn't just that. It happens in primary care settings. It happens in a variety of places, and that essentially, we don't ask the follow-up question. We don't go a little deeper,
Yeah.
and I always kind of say, like, if we're going to talk talk about patriarchy and privilege, right?
Yeah.
And we should, first of all, like, on top of that, one of the rules of the patriarchy is don't question the patriarchy. So you
Fight
don't
Club.
question it, right? You don't question it, right? So,
Yeah.
and we see this in primary care settings that doesn't
Yeah.
matter who the primary care doctor is, what gender they are,
Yeah.
they will not ask follow-up questions.
Yeah.
So men become underserved by these
Yes.
gender dynamics, and I think that, like, programs that begin to help us understand what that looks like, we all need it because we all have implicit bias. Like, again,
Yeah.
implicit bias research, gender is the strongest implicit bias we have, first of all. Most people have a negative implicit bias towards men,
Yeah.
men included, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
typically they're the ones who cause us the most suffering,
Good
right?
point.
And again, if we understand that we all have it, including me,
Yep. Especially
I am
you, Matt.
endless, especially me, right? But I mean, but if I can admit that, then I think you can admit it too, right? And then we begin to have these conversations about
Yeah.
how we often do look for the negative. And again, that's what I was saying where we started. We
Right.
look for the negative. We expect that, so we never even have the space to see healthy prosocial. And the
Yes.
way it impacts boys in schools is dramatic in terms of how it leads to disconnection. And I think that, again, it's this notion that if we don't come to someone, like, we're worried about this now.
Yeah.
Like, now all of a sudden we realize, oh, wait a minute, men aren't going to college as much, and they aren't, and wait a minute, like, wait, we're worried about this stuff now,
Yep.
but but most of those trends have been consistent for a long time, and I'm glad we're worried about it now.
I
But
do
we,
I do think we're seeing kind of a multiplier of these problems with the internet
yeah,
and with
yeah,
gaming and with porn and with AI. So
yeah,
I totally agree with you. I think these patterns have been here with us for a long time,
yeah,
but I think the dial is getting turned up
yeah,
because I think men have more ability to disinclude themselves from community and from society with these other avenues. It just seems like, oddly enough, I'm working with a number of men who are dealing with, like, sexual addictions, and then AI is, like, somehow that they're acting out with AI, and so there's yeah, I think all these patterns are playing out, and they're just getting amplified.
yeah, yeah,
And then
yeah,
I was gonna say one thing too, and I don't wanna put words in your mouth, so correct me, but I think with everything you just said, and I guess I'm putting myself where you're at too. So I think when we say that, and I want to say we as a field or those in the field who represent your perspective, which I agree with, we're not apologizing for the harms that men have committed. So I'm not like a male apologist. I'm not a male's right activist. However, I want to give men all the responsibility they can for all the good and the bad. And there is a lot of bad being done by men. And so I want to hold men accountable to that. At the same time, though, I wanna say men are chronically being underserved by our field. I'm not obfuscating, the harms committed by men. I mean, if you look at who's doing all the rapes, who's doing all the violent crimes, who's doing all the domestic violence and all the murders and the carjackings, and who's filling up the prisons, it's all men. So something's going on here. I get the anger. I mean, me growing up, my relationship with my dad, I was kinda terrified by men too. I had a lot of wounds from my dad. I
yeah,
felt very much akin to the feminist critiques of masculinity and of men. I grew up kind of feeling terrified of men. And that Matt, we've never met in person. I'm 6'7". I'm a huge imposing man.
yeah,
Internally, though, I was kinda terrified by men, and so I feel like I've kind of done a 180 now where I'm like, "No, wait, I wanna be an advocate for men because ultimately, I wanna see men change and grow and develop and, I don't know, access the better angels of our nature, become our higher selves,
yeah,
become fully human, and the only way I see that potentially, possibly ever happening is through supporting and empowering men, to to become their best selves. I don't think we're going to critique men into doing that. And so again, I'm not like a men's rights activist or an apologist for men on a so I don't know if that's a needed
Yeah, I mean, I think it's
equivocation.
no, I think particularly in, like, our profession, whatever that is, whether it's helping professions, but I think within the field of counseling, for example, I think that's a there's a conversation to be had around this, around, like, at the same time, acknowledging the impact of kind of male power and privilege and patriarchy and the harms around that, at the same time, figuring out and where do you find and also as a helper, where do you find compassion for this? And I think
Yes.
that when I work with my students, like, I don't majority of my students aren't male. The majority of my students actually are, definitely not, right? And the reality is the help that men get is not going to be from people like you and I. It's
Yeah.
gonna be probably from female identified therapists for the most part.
Yeah.
That's just numbers, okay?
Yep. Yep.
Um, but the reality is like and I also think that a lot of people across the spectrum have been hurt by men in their lives, right?
Yeah.
And as a helping professionals, where do we find compassion around this, right? And I think
Mhm.
when I have the opportunity to teach this with my students, by the end we get there, right?
Yeah.
But it takes a lot at times to get through some of the noise and the nonsense and to understand that component. And I think that's the part that I think it's not aligning with the wrongs done to men. I
Mhm.
don't think that's the way of looking at it. I think it's more understanding about kind of like, so why are things the way that they are?
Yep.
How do you have compassion for some of that in a way like, because if we don't have compassion around it and we can't name it, then that is actually disingenuous to men as well. And I would say this quickly, like,
Yeah.
I do a little political consulting right now too around this. And, if you can't name the problem, then it's a problem. Like, for example, Trump was really good at naming the problem and aligning with the grievance. Now his
Yeah.
policies are horrible. They make things much worse, right?
Yeah.
But at least he could name it, right? And the Democratic side has a struggle for many reasons why it's a hard
Yes.
time to name it, right? But if you can't name it, it doesn't have face validity,
Yeah.
right? And I think as therapists, it's like, how do we kind of look at ways to have some compassion and meet guys where they are with what they need? And I think
Yeah.
if you do, you're right. I think you offer hope.
Absolutely.
And when you
Absolutely.
don't, then you're the person who's now standing there offering the sandwich
Yes.
and saying,
Absolutely.
"Well, you know, I offered this crap sandwich and he
Yep.
didn't want it. So what's wrong with him?" Right?
Right.
You know?
Why won't you eat the crappy sandwich? Uh,
Yeah.
well, and I feel like it was an epiphany or a light bulb, 'cause I read your 2013 paper with Mark, and I think there was a line in there where you discussed kind of the using the positive psychology framework of leveraging the strengths to counteract the weaknesses.
Yeah.
But that you have to first acknowledge that there's strengths there to leverage.
Yeah.
So to me, that was like, okay, that's where the compassion comes in. And that's where there's a pathway of addressing this is like discover and identify the strengths in masculinity and use those to kind of put a limiter on where the harmful expressions come out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
100%. 100%.